a life that's full, I traveled east.
We begin with the unexpected death of Lisa Marie Presley. Mourners have been leaving flowers at the gates of Graceland, where just this past Sunday,
in a stunning revelation that's already sending tremors through the global music community, a private letter handwritten by Elvis Presley himself has surfaced nearly 5 decades after his untimely death. Sealed away in a dusty envelope hidden in a private estate in Tupelo, Mississippi, this letter may be the most intimate and explosive document ever connected to the king of rock and roll. Its contents, disturbing, personal, and deeply unsettling. For nearly 47 years, the world believed it knew the story of Elvis Presley, the meteoric rise, the glittering fame, the tragic downfall. But this letter, dated just 6 days before his death, suggests something far more haunting, a final cry for help from a man consumed by the very machine that made him a legend. In his own words, Presley paints a picture not of stardom but of betrayal, manipulation, and a golden cage built by those closest to him. And now, for the first time, that voice, silenced for decades, is being heard. What was in that letter? Who did he name? And why was it hidden for so long? Tonight we take you inside the final days of Elvis Presley and the secret he never intended for the world to see. He was born in a 2-room house in Tupelo, Mississippi, a quiet, unassuming beginning for a man who would soon set the world on fire. Elvis Aaron Presley wasn't just a star. He was a cultural detonation. By the time most Americans heard his voice for the first time, the transformation was already underway. A young man with a sultry tone, a rebellious sneer, and hips that sent shockwaves through living rooms, Elvis wasn't performing. He was igniting something. When he burst onto the scene in the 1950s, he didn't just make music, he made history. With a sound that fused black rhythm and blues with southern gospel and country twang, Elvis carved out a sound that was unmistakably his own. But this fusion, however revolutionary, wasn't without controversy. Some hailed him as a bridge between segregated cultures, others accused him of cultural appropriation, a white Southern man profiting off a sound rooted in Black America. Yet even his fiercest critics couldn't deny Elvis Presley had arrived, and the world would never be the same. By the end of the decade, he was everywhere. Radios, TV sets, theaters, magazine covers. The raw magnetism was undeniable. Women screamed, parents panicked, preachers condemned. But the real story wasn't just the sound, it was the system beginning to form around him, a growing machine of handlers, contracts, and expectations that would lift him to the clouds and eventually pull him down. Because even as he conquered the charts, a more dangerous force was building behind the curtain, fame at a level few could survive. By the early 1970s, the Elvis Presley the world knew, the hip-swinging rebel, the electrifying showman, was beginning to fade behind rhinestone jumpsuits and Vegas stage lights. Outwardly, he was still the king. The sold-out concerts, the screaming fans, the glimmer of American royalty. But behind the curtain, the man was unraveling. Elvis's marriage to Priscilla had collapsed, the result of infidelity, emotional distance, and the relentless toll of life in the spotlight. His relationship with fame had turned toxic. No longer liberating, it had become suffocating. And then there were the pills, prescription drugs, dozens of them. Uppers to wake up, downers to sleep, painkillers to keep performing. It wasn't just a bad habit, it was a system. Enabled by personal doctors and surrounded by yes men, Elvis's dependence on medication was no secret, but it was strategically ignored. Those around him had every reason to keep the machine running. Every show sold meant more money, more influence, more power. So the warnings were silenced. The decline, hidden behind makeup and bright lights. On stage it showed. Some nights he was brilliant, a flash of the old fire. Other nights he slurred lyrics, forgot lines, and wandered the stage disoriented. But the fans kept coming, desperate for one more glimpse of the legend. Yet behind every performance was a man slipping further from reality, not just sick, but trapped. And while the media packaged Elvis as a symbol of enduring glamour, those closest to him knew the truth. The king of rock and roll was dying in plain sight, and few were willing to stop it. To the outside world, Graceland was a palace, a monument to success, but inside its walls, the king's sanctuary was slowly becoming his prison. Surrounded by the so-called Memphis Mafia, an entourage of childhood friends, cousins, bodyguards, and hangers-on, Elvis was rarely alone but deeply isolated. Their job was to protect him. Instead, many enabled him, fed off him, and helped build a world where the truth couldn't survive. Over time, the lines blurred. What started as loyalty turned into complicity. There were whispered interventions, but more often, silence. Pill handoffs became routine. Doctor visits turned into prescription pickups. Meanwhile, Elvis's behavior grew erratic. He wandered Graceland's halls at night, armed, quoting scripture, speaking of divine missions and secret government threats. Security cameras weren't installed to keep out fans. They were aimed inward, watching those on the inside. Conspiracies, paranoia, religious obsession, it all blended into a mental fog that few dared to challenge. Not because they didn't notice, but because challenging Elvis meant losing access to the legend and the lifestyle that came with him. Even his family saw the shift. Lisa Marie, his young daughter, visited less. Priscilla, already divorced, found herself pushed out entirely. What remained was a closed circle with a rising temperature, arguments behind locked doors, vanishing medications, midnight rants, and a fear that no one could quite explain or stop. Elvis, once the heartbeat of rock and roll, had become a man slowly retreating into shadows, and within those shadows, something was building. Not just self-destruction, but the feeling that time was running out. By the mid-1970s, Elvis Presley was living inside a chemical fog, one prescribed, endorsed, and sustained by those closest to him. He had a pharmacy at his fingertips, amphetamines to get him out of bed, barbiturates to bring him down, painkillers to keep him moving, and tranquilizers to quiet the storms in his head. But this wasn't addiction in secret. It was addiction in plain view, cloaked in fame and disguised as routine. Doctors who should have said no, didn't. Associates who should have intervened, looked away. And the people who called themselves friends, many were too dependent on the Presley empire to risk speaking out. The result? A man unraveling before everyone's eyes. Off stage, Elvis was increasingly irritable, paranoid, and physically deteriorating. He often lashed out at staff, made erratic decisions, and became consumed with control. Relationships suffered. Loyalty gave way to fear. And still, the pills kept coming. Financially, the picture wasn't any brighter. Despite earning hundreds of millions, Elvis's estate was bleeding. Lavish spending, poor business deals, and a bloated entourage drained his fortune faster than it came in. And at the center of that financial disaster stood one man, Colonel Tom Parker. The manager who'd once guided Elvis to superstardom was now pocketing a staggering 50% of his earnings, a deal almost unheard of in the industry. Many believe Parker deliberately overworked Elvis, kept him sedated, distracted, and on the road, not to revive his career, but to control his revenue stream. And in the chaos, Elvis, the man, was fading fast. Because when everyone around you profits from your decline, who's left to pull you back? To some, Colonel Tom Parker was a genius, the architect of Elvis Presley's fame. To others, he was something far more sinister, the man who orchestrated his destruction from behind a velvet curtain. Born Andreas van Quake, a Dutch immigrant who reinvented himself in America, Parker built a career on smoke mirrors and unshakable control. He wasn't just Elvis's manager, he was his gatekeeper, his decision-maker, his shadow. But as Presley's star grew, so did Parker's grip. Contracts were signed that gave him 50% of Elvis's earnings, a staggering figure even in the cutthroat world of entertainment. Critics argue Parker didn't just mismanage Presley's career, he weaponized it. Instead of allowing Elvis to grow as an artist, Parker boxed him into relentless tours, Vegas residencies, and film deals that favored volume over value. Artistic freedom was off the table. Behind the scenes, there were whispers that Parker had a reason to keep Elvis working, no matter the cost: gambling debts, ties to shady figures, personal secrets that could implode his empire if ever exposed. Elvis, increasingly isolated and dependent, didn't push back. Whether out of loyalty, fear, or sedation, he followed orders, even as the cracks widened and the performances faltered. By the mid-70s, those closest to the king could see it clearly. Elvis wasn't being managed. He was being drained. And Parker? He kept the cameras rolling, the contracts signed, and the legend just lucid enough to take the stage again. Because to the Colonel, Elvis wasn't a person, he was a product. And products don't rest, they perform, until they break. Inside Graceland, betrayal didn't come with a headline. It came in silence from the people who were supposed to care the most. Elvis Presley was surrounded but profoundly alone. The faces that flanked him, friends, bodyguards, business associates, weren't just familiar, they were embedded in his daily life. The so-called Memphis Mafia was hand-picked, trusted, loyal, at least in theory. But as his health declined, their loyalty blurred into dependence. They watched him stumble through rehearsals. They watched him pass out in chairs. They laughed at his mistakes, even as the signs of collapse became impossible to miss. They told themselves it was for his own good, that they were protecting the king. But in reality, many were just protecting access to the lifestyle, the status, the money, and Elvis knew it. In his rare moments of clarity, he reportedly lashed out, accusing longtime companions of feeding off him like leeches, of stepping over him while he was unconscious, of choosing comfort over truth. The betrayal didn't stop with the Mafia. Family ties strained under the pressure. Lisa Marie, just a child, saw less and less of her father. Priscilla, once his greatest confidante, found herself emotionally cut off. Their marriage had ended, but her concern never did. Yet Elvis no longer let her in. Even those who loved him seemed helpless or unwilling to face what was unfolding. And so the man who had given the world so much found himself drifting away, with no one strong enough to stop the tide. In the end, it wasn't just addiction or pressure that destroyed Elvis Presley. It was abandonment. Not all at once, but in quiet moments behind closed doors when looking away was easier than speaking up. August 16, 1977. He was just 42 years old. The official cause? Heart failure. But almost immediately, cracks began to appear in the story, and questions started pouring in. The timeline didn't add up. Reports conflicted. Witness accounts shifted. And most notably, the toxicology report delayed, redacted, and ultimately unsettling. A staggering cocktail of sedatives, painkillers, anti-anxiety meds, and antidepressants had flooded his system. The sheer number of drugs found was no longer speculation, it was documented. Experts argued that what killed Elvis wasn't just a heart condition, it was the collapse of a body overwhelmed by chemical dependency. A fatal crash after years of slow decay. But if that was true, who was responsible? Why were the doctors never charged? Why did his entourage continue supplying him? And how much did the people profiting off Elvis's legacy truly know and ignore? For some it was negligence. For others, it was something more calculated. Conspiracy theories erupted. Was the scene tampered with? Were medical documents altered to protect the Presley brand? After all, a tragic overdose might have endangered a billion-dollar empire. Then came the fringe theories. That Elvis had faked his death. That he'd staged an escape from fame. That he was hiding in the southwest Argentina, or even just miles from Graceland under a different name. These claims were rarely credible, but always popular. A reflection of how desperately fans wanted to believe the king hadn't truly left the building. But maybe the real mystery wasn't whether Elvis disappeared. Maybe the real story was how we all watched him fade for years and did nothing. And just as the world moved on, a new discovery would pull it all back into the spotlight. In early 2025, nearly 5 decades after Elvis Presley's death, an unmarked envelope changed everything. It was discovered at a private estate sale in Tupelo, Mississippi, buried among forgotten memorabilia and concert posters. Inside, a letter, unsent, unmailed, but undeniably real. The handwriting was Elvis's familiar, slanted and scrawled in blue ink on yellowing Graceland stationery. The date, August 10, 1977, just 6 days before his death. But this wasn't a farewell note, it wasn't a goodbye, it was something else entirely. A confession, a reckoning, a plea. To those who stood beside me and to those who let me fall, it began. What followed was a raw, unfiltered torrent of emotion. Elvis wrote not just of failed relationships, but of systemic betrayal. He described being used, not as a man but as a product, a puppet, a prisoner. He named names, managers, friends, handlers. He accused them of manipulation, of silence, of cashing checks while he crumbled. One line in particular echoed with venom. I made millions, and somehow ended up owned by everyone but myself. He called out Colonel Tom Parker directly. Parker sold my soul to Vegas, and not one of you stopped him. He turned on the Memphis Mafia, describing them as leeches who laughed while he forgot his lyrics, who handed him pills and stepped over him when he passed out. And then came the most painful section, his family. He accused them of protecting the image, not the man, of choosing silence over honesty, of loving the legend, not the person. Priscilla was addressed not with anger, but devastating sadness. You stopped loving me when I stopped being magic, he wrote. But I never stopped needing you. And Lisa Marie, just 9 years old at the time, was mentioned with aching brevity. Tell her I loved her. Tell her I wanted to be better. But I couldn't hear her voice through the noise anymore. Perhaps the most chilling passage came near the end. If I don't wake up one morning, don't call it an accident. Call it what it is. Slow murder. One pill at a time. The letter closed with a final haunting plea. Burn this if you have to. But don't pretend you didn't know. You all knew. You just needed me to keep singing. It was never mailed. Never shown. Experts believe it had been locked away in his personal desk, silenced like the man who wrote it. And now, after decades of speculation, that silence is broken. Elvis Presley's final words weren't a goodbye. They were a warning. In that letter, stripped of sequins and spotlight, Elvis Presley revealed what many had suspected, that behind the glory of the crown was a cage. Fame didn't just elevate him, it devoured him. The man who once symbolized rebellion and youth became a prisoner of his own image. He couldn't grieve, couldn't falter, couldn't even breathe, without risking headlines. "They called me the king," he wrote. "But I wasn't free." He wasn't exaggerating. He hadn't walked down a public street in over a decade. Every moment of joy, sorrow, anger or pain was packaged, sold or spun into press releases. He smiled when he wanted to cry, performed when he should have rested, and all the while, the machine around him, the managers, the media, the marketers, kept spinning, feeding off his energy, his talent, his life. Elvis wasn't just addicted to pills, he was addicted to surviving in a world that never let him stop. Friends handed him medication like breath mints. Doctors scribbled prescriptions like autographs. The people closest to him either needed him sedated, or preferred him that way. It wasn't just neglect, it was orchestration, a slow dismantling of a man whose only crime was giving the world what it wanted. And when the lights went out, those same people sanitized his story, repackaged the myth, protected the brand. But this letter, it burned through the facade. It showed the truth. Elvis Presley didn't die suddenly. He died in pieces, over years. Each pill, each betrayal, each silence, a slow undoing. And he knew it. He felt it. He wrote it. Now for the first time, the man behind the music is finally heard, not as a superstar, but as a human being, wounded, exhausted, and ultimately, abandoned. He was born poor, became a symbol, and died a mystery. But now with one forgotten letter, Elvis Presley's voice cuts through decades of myth-making to tell the story no one wanted to hear. Not the fans, not the family, and certainly not the empire that continues to profit from his name. This wasn't the voice of a rock legend, it was the voice of a man unraveling, furious, fragile, and desperate to be heard without a stage, without a spotlight, and without the need to entertain. In the pages of that final message, Elvis doesn't ask for sympathy, he demands truth. He doesn't beg for forgiveness, he calls for accountability. He doesn't want to be remembered as an icon, he wants to be remembered as a man, one who was loved by millions, but left behind by the few who could have saved him. The king never truly left the building. He was locked inside it, by contracts, by dependency, by fear, and by the people who needed him to keep singing until his body finally gave out. And as the impersonators take the stage, the records spin, and the tours march on, we're left with a haunting truth. They didn't kill Elvis all at once. They did it slowly, and they did it while we watched. This video is intended for informational and entertainment purposes only. While it is based on publicly available reports, interviews, and cultural discussions, some elements, including alleged letters, personal accounts, and speculative details, remain unverified or based on rumors. The creators of this video do not claim to present definitive historical facts, nor is this video meant to defame or discredit any individual or entity mentioned. All statements regarding health, addiction, and interpersonal relationships are drawn from widely reported claims and should be viewed as part of a broader narrative, not as medical or legal conclusions. Viewer discretion is advised due to the sensitive nature of topics, including substance abuse, emotional distress, and allegations of misconduct.